Before I get into the detail of the research itself, it's my pleasure and my duty to thank a few people and a few organisations actually who've been absolutely crucial to this research. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Arts and Humanities Research Council, or the Money as we knew them, who actually funded this whole research project. Nearly 3 years in the making, and we really pushed them, I think, in terms of their usual methods of working, often through naivety, I think, on Wired Sussex's part, because we'd never taken part in an academic research project this big before, but they always came back in a supportive way, and always were up for the kind of strange and weird things that we suggested as part of the research project. A large number of organisations also put time, expertise and resources towards this project, and some of the main ones are up on the screen there, and I'd really like to thank all of those, particularly actually Anne Morrison, who's the director of the BBC Academy. She was with us last night and couldn't be here today because she chaired the advisory board for Brighton Fuse. And of course there was us who delivered it. I mean, this has been a really interesting journey, I think, for all of the people involved, the two universities, Wired Sussex and the National Centre for University and Business. And it's been fascinating to watch a group of, I think, almost 12 researchers in total work on this project, and it's been a real collaboration of equals. We've all brought different things to the party. That's, I think, what's made this research project so interesting and so successful. And finally, I think thanks to those of you in the audience, and I can see some of you now, who helped us deliver this research by either taking part in pilot questionnaires, taking part in the main questionnaires, taking part in the detailed one-to-one interviews, taking part in the videos that we made as part of this project, all those different ways that you contributed to the project. Without it, there would be no research. So, thanks. Brighton Fuse took about, as I said, about 30 months of work by around about a dozen researchers from 2 different universities. And the final report, which Steve was holding up, is what, 50 or 60 pages long, something like that. And to be honest, that only scratches the surface of the stuff that was found. So I'm going to struggle, I've got to be honest, to encapsulate everything that's in the report in the next 30 minutes or so. But you can download the full report, the executive summary, if you just want the top line details, and our policy recommendations on the Brighton Fuse website. So that's available for you to download from now. Whilst all these organisations that I've talked about took part in the research, actually there's a kind of disclaimer alert, if you like, now, because what I'm going to do is talk about my interpretation of some of that research, and particularly necessarily in the time I've got, it's not going to be as detailed or as nuanced actually as the report itself. So I do really recommend, for those of you who want to understand the detail of the report, to have a go at kind of reading it. And my apologies now actually to the researchers who are sitting over there and over there, that you're probably going to hold your head in your hands by the end of it, because of the way that I've taken your beautifully subtle research findings and made them very simple and straightforward. So to that I apologise. Has everyone read this? If you tick the box, we can move on. Okay. So a bit of context first. In 2009-2010, the Council for Industry and Higher Education got together a group of people to look at some of the issues facing high growth businesses in the UK and universities. And they came up with a number of recommendations. This wasn't a research report, this was more like a kind of think tank thing. And they came up with a number of recommendations. And one of those recommendations was that the way that governments and the way that policymakers thought about clusters was probably inappropriate. And the way that governments thought about clusters was they thought about you're either a technology cluster or you're a creative industries cluster, but you're not a technology and creative industries cluster. And so what the Fuse report suggested was, you know, in a world of Google, of Wikipedia, of all these kind of businesses which bring together creativity and technology, that was no longer an appropriate way of thinking about it. So it suggested this term, CDIT, Creative plus Digital plus IT, as a way of proposing a different way of thinking about businesses and clusters and bringing them together. Now, it's a fairly crude term in some ways because you know, what it wasn't trying to suggest is that technology can't be inherently creative in and of itself. Of course it can. You know, you don't have to bring creativity to everything. It can be embodied in it itself, and the same is true of technology. But those are the terms that government and policymakers use, digital, IT, ICT and creative. Therefore, that's the term that the Fuse used as well. What it's really talking about, to be honest, is this. It's talking about taking understanding and knowledge and expertise and experience from the arts, from humanities, from design, and adding that to digital technology. So that's really what CDIT means. And you may think, actually, that idea of adding creativity and technology together isn't that radical. St. Steve said it way back in the day here, you know. And it kind of seems obvious, but it's not obvious, actually. There are many ways that this differentiation between the arts and between technology is seen through in our everyday lives, particularly when you're talking about public sector institutions. So, you know, here we are in the arts faculty of the University of Brighton, and way up the road is a computer science department. And as the report says, you know, it's very rare to bring those two faculties or departments together in any university. It's almost as if they're volatile liquids that you can't bring together. But the same's true of other areas of public policy. So in terms of the government skills councils, you have one skills council for the creative industry and you have another skills council for technology. In terms of business classifications, the so-called SIC codes, which every business has to tick a box to say we're in this classification or in that classification, doesn't really bend to the subtlety of creativity and technology being part of what one company could actually do. So in that way, CDIT was a challenge to a lot of policy assumptions. Okay, Brighton. So that report went to government, and there was some interest, particularly from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, about the report, and that gave us, the four partners, the opportunity to pitch the idea of actually testing that concept of CDIT in a real place, in real time. And that's what the Brighton Fuse is about. It's about looking at the scale and the size and the growth of this CDIT cluster, and about how people and companies and the community interact to grow and support and underpin that cluster itself. actually, the final, and so all four of the institutions pitched this idea to the AHRC, and the final deal was done in Manhattan, in a jazz bar on 46th Street at 2 in the morning between the CEO of the NCUB and the CEO of the AHRC. So to me that felt quite nicely Brighton, that's how the deal was done, drunk in a jazz club. Okay, a little bit about our research and the method. Now, we were looking at a cluster which doesn't kind of exist in government figures, so we had to do the whole thing from the bottom up. We had to start by saying what companies in Brighton might be part of this cluster. So it wasn't a question of going, okay, they're categorised, companies are categorised in these areas, and we'll just bring them together and that will give us a sense of the cluster. We had to look at a huge number of companies individually and decide whether or not they were in the cluster. And we actually looked, I didn't, I've got to say, but the researchers did, looked at 7,500 companies, analysed 7,500 companies in Brighton. If you spent 10 minutes looking at each company, that would take you, one researcher, 9 months to do. So that was a hell of a lot of work. And what they found was 1,495 companies were part of the CDIC cluster. So that gives us a sense of the size of the CDIC cluster in Brighton, about 1,500 companies. We sent each of those companies a questionnaire. It was a very detailed questionnaire. It would have taken you about 45 minutes to fill in, and it asked a lot of kind of commercially sensitive information as well as a lot of personal information. Typically, researchers tell me that for these kind of questionnaires you get a 3 to 5% response rate, something like that, and if you get 10%, that's very good. We got 32.4% response rate, an incredible response rate, which gave us a huge amount of information and data, which we anonymised, but which gave us the basis for the research and the research report. But then on top of that, we did over 75 actually, in-depth follow-up interviews as well. So an incredible amount of detailed research, and some of the stuff that we found, you may go, well, that's obvious. Some of it you may go, well, we didn't expect that. But the truth is that this is an empirically rigorous piece of research which is absolutely founded in core statistical evidence, and that gives it its robustness, and that I think is why, as Steve said, we had so much interest from policymakers and the government and other industry bodies when we did a London launch last night. Okay, let's get on to the meat of the matter. So Brighton is roughly an economy that's worth about £5.5 billion a year, sort of roughly. Tony Myrna from the Economic Partnership is sitting there checking on the... 5.9. 5.9, whoa, it's gone up. Okay, we're roughly a £6 billion a year economy. And these are some of the big hitters in that economy. So we've got the universities, and the universities reckon that they add nearly £1 billion to the economy, about, I think it's 980 million or something like that a year. So a significant chunk of money there. We've got the visitor economy or tourism, which adds about £750 million a year. And then we've got the nighttime economy, which is lots of people having lots of gut busters in the cafe down the road. What's the cafe down the road? Market Diner. Market Diner, yeah. So 370 odd £million worth of gut busters every year in this economy. And then we got CDIT, and what we found was that CDIT is worth £730 million a year to the economy. which is an enormous amount of money when you think about it. This is a sector that 20 years ago didn't exist. It's really only got into its stride 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it's already snapping at the heels of the thing that's defined Brighton's economy for the last 100 plus years. So £730 million of value. Okay, so that's how much it's worth, or that's how much it was worth in 2011 when we got the results of the survey. What about growth of the sector? Well, the average CDIC company grows by nearly 15% per year. The median growth is 3.8%. And that's at a time, over a period, 2010-11, when the UK economy grew by 0.7%. So far, far outstripping the UK economy as a whole. Far. And what about jobs growth? So what is Brighton's CDIT sector adding to employment in the city? Well, jobs growth in the CDIT sector is growing at 4 times the rate of jobs growth in Brighton and Hove's overall economy. It's growing at 2 times the rate of jobs growth of the same sectors in the rest of the southeast of England, the powerhouse of the UK economy. And it's going 10 times the rate of the UK's overall economy in terms of jobs growth. It's worth mentioning, and I should have mentioned it at a time actually, when we did those analyses of the statistics, what they don't include is freelancers. And we knew that freelancers are an important part of the cluster here, and we particularly knew that they were vital for small companies because they enabled small companies to flex and find talent and skills at short notice. But we didn't include them, and the more we looked at it, the more that we found that freelancers were kind of important. So we didn't have the capacity or the funding to look at freelancers as part of this research, but we've just been given the okay by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to do some follow-on research around the role of freelancers in the cluster. So if you're a freelancer, your time will come. But also it means that we didn't include the value that freelancers deliver to the economy in our figures. So we don't know what that's going to be, but we can aggregate that in to the figures when we've got that data. It's worth thinking about those stats that I talked about in the context of some of the other statistics about the broader Brighton economy. So Brighton is, I think, number 5 per head of population in the UK for startups. It's in the top 5 in the UK per head of population for private sector jobs growth. And outside of some small areas of London, it's number 1 in the UK in terms of productivity growth. When you look at those figures for the CDIT economy, you can begin to understand, I think, why that is. Everyone with me so far? Stunned silence. Okay, so that's some top-line figures about the CDIT cluster. Who are the people who are building these companies? Who are the CDIT entrepreneurs? The leaders, the founders, the CEOs, and the MDs of these companies. Well, the first thing to say about them is they're not from Brighton. How many people here actually were born in Brighton or went to school in Brighton? Yeah, it's about the same. We're a city of outsiders, people, in many ways. 90% plus came from outside the city. Really significant number. And why did they come here? Well, 73% said that lifestyle was an important reason, and 30% said it was the main reason. The top reason by far, and there's a whole bunch of reasons, why people came to this city was because of the lifestyle. And lifestyle is a kind of complicated term, really. I pulled one quote from the research, which tries to sum that up. And by the way, all the quotes, most of the quotes that I'm going to use are anonymized, because that's what we did, unless the person specifically gave the okay for their name to be used. And you'll see a couple of people said that was fine. But this is, this sort of sums it up. And people talked about, as well as the lifestyle of the city being the reason why they came here, they also talked about how they use that lifestyle in their business. I remember one company talking about how they specifically invite clients down during the Arts Festival in May, because they think it's a good way to show off both the city and their place in the city. So people use the lifestyle element as a business thing. But it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because in this digital age, where the argument is a company can be based anywhere, place remains really, really important. And place is very significant when it comes to the reason we've got a cluster here. It's the place. Stupid. So, one of the things we found, though, is that the fastest growing reason that people give, the entrepreneurs, the leaders they give for coming here, is actually to start a company. So I suppose it makes sense that people who came here before the cluster formed couldn't give the reason that they were coming here as because the cluster existed. But more recently, people have given the reason to come here that there is a cluster and they want to form a company within that cluster. What hasn't happened, though, is the importance of lifestyle hasn't dropped. So lifestyle is really important. Other factors have dropped. Forming a company has gone up as well. So the cluster becomes self-sustaining, but the value of all those things that make up the Brighton lifestyle continue to be really, really important. And I think that's kind of summed up in some ways by this quote here. Okay, so what about the education of these seeded entrepreneurs? Ooh. So the degrees, we looked at the degrees that they had, and this was not something I think that we expected. So 31% of the people who formed or run these seeded companies in Brighton have arts and humanities degrees. If you add the arts and humanities with the design, actually it's nearly half of everybody. So what we've got in, and much smaller numbers around science, technology, engineering, maths, computing, and business management and economics degrees. So what we've got in this city is arts entrepreneurs, actually, a core part of the reason why the sector is kind of important. And I suppose, you can come up with various reasons why that might be, from if you've got an arts degree, you can't get a job, so you might as well start a company, if you're very cynical. To, on the other hand, actually, it gives you those skills in terms of problem solving, critiquing, being able to come at things from a different angle that a lot of seeded companies need or demand. Okay, so that's the entrepreneurs, the seeded leaders themselves. What about the kind of companies that they formed? And Steve mentioned it, so it's not going to be much of a surprise. But the researchers looked at various elements of these companies and divided them into three categories. Unfused, and that means companies that only focus on either creative content or technology. Fused, which means they bring together creative content and technology in the work that they do. And SuperFused. And SuperFused is about actually, that bringing together of creative content and technology as the core of the value proposition for those companies. It's absolutely central to their DNA. Hi, Julia. And what this points to, I think, is that actually seed it is a strategy within individual companies. It's not just a strategy within the cluster as a whole. So individual companies combine the arts, humanities, design learning with digital technology and ICT skills in order to drive their business forward. Okay. Basically, of those, of the respondents to the questionnaire, effectively a third fell into the fused bracket, a third fell into the unfused bracket, and a third fell into the superfused bracket. So they were fairly evenly divided. Where they weren't evenly divided was in terms of growth rates. So if you look at growth rates by fusion, you can see that the superfused companies were far more significant in terms of their growth and their growth potential than the fused, but certainly more than the unfused. In fact, the median growth rate for the unfused was negative. That's shrunk. So superfused companies are really driving the sector which is driving Brighton. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to skills, Brighton's talent economy, and I think this is a key area. And what we found was that in terms of skills, we have an opportunity in this city, and the opportunity is obviously based around the lifestyle. Not only attracts entrepreneurs, it attracts talent to the city as well. And talent's really important because for seeded businesses, talent is the raw material. It's no longer iron and steel. It's no longer, these kind of raw materials. It's people with talents that every city in the world is trying to attract. And we've got some kind of built-in advantages. And you can see when you talk to companies, the effort that they put into finding, attaining, acquiring, and keeping talented people is actually central to what they are about. So we've got an inbuilt advantage, as I said, in terms of the lifestyle offer. It's very attractive to talent. However, we've also got some challenges. So one challenge is, interestingly, that over 20% of the bigger seeded companies said that they thought that the lifestyle of Brighton was an impediment in terms of enabling them to grow. So the very same companies that had benefited from the lifestyle in order to start and attract initial talent, when they got to a certain size, found that more problematic, more difficult. And it may actually be that that's just the growing pains of bigger companies having to deal with a model which is built on individual talent rather than something specific to Brighton. But it's certainly something that they listed as a barrier to growth. Something else that they listed as a barrier to growth was the skills of people in terms of the rapid changes in the seeded economy, and particularly the challenges for managerial skills. And when you kind of think back to that earlier slide about how few people came into business and became entrepreneurs with those management skills, you can begin to understand why you've got lots of arts entrepreneurs out there who need some support in terms of management skills, and they're actually saying that themselves. Their management skills are a barrier to their growth. What we found as well was that SuperFused companies use lots of different devices and methods and approaches and cultures to try and fuse the different skill sets within their own individual companies. So they'd find various different ways and give a real primacy, actually, particularly SuperFused companies, to workplace culture and how workplace culture can enable them to keep the talent, retain the talent, but also to give that talent permission to kind of innovate within the company, and also bring together people from maybe technology and arts backgrounds who wouldn't necessarily fit together in the same company. So it was really interesting to look at the various different ways that companies are using, really working hard to find ways to create a unified culture. And, you know, the right type of workplace is central to that. So, you know, there needs to be, you know, one of the things I think we'd suggest is there needs to be some sensitivity and subtlety to workplace strategies within Brighton that understand that it's not just square footage that companies need, but somewhere where they can kind of build a culture. So companies themselves are trying to create SuperFused skill sets. When it comes to specific skills that individuals need, we found almost the opposite. So to try and sort of demonstrate this, I just pulled this off. This is a calendar from the SCIF. I don't know if people know the SCIF. It's a co-working space that Wired Sussex supports in the North Lanes. And in the evening in the SCIF, lots of community groups kind of meet. And what you see there, in this case in terms of programming skills, is how many different meetups are organised to enable individuals from various different companies and freelancers to keep up to date with the skills that they need, their very specific skills. So what you've got is this process whereby the companies themselves are trying to develop the SuperFused skills, and the community or the cluster itself is trying to kind of self-organise ways in which individuals within companies can actually develop very specific skills that they need in order to do their job. Probably the opposite of what we expected. Okay, this is the question that's always asked of Brighton. Are we ambitious, or are we ambitious enough? I mean, I think the first thing to say about that, there's three things I think that I want to say, and the third one really picks up on some of the research findings. And the first is that actually ambition is what academics would probably call a contested term. In other words, it means different things to different people. So the way that the government often thinks about it is in terms of, are you developing enough gross value added for UK PLC? But actually, you might be ambitious to run a company, have a nice life, but also give something back to the community, or spend lots of time with your family. And that's probably just as legitimate a definition, if not a more legitimate definition of ambition than some other definition. So we have to be careful, I think, first of all, about, you know, just accepting at face value definitions of ambition that are foisted on us. But also, I think, even if we accept that, compared to whom? So we assume that we haven't created as many big CDIC companies in this city as other places. Now, this wasn't a comparative piece of research, but Brighton does have, you know, some fast-growing companies, iCrossing, Brandwatch, Kineo. You know, there's a bunch of them in Brighton, and it's certainly not clear that per head of population, or, you know, in terms of the number of companies, that's any less than a lot of other places. But I think the final element is that there are kind of some limits in terms of the way that the Brighton cluster has developed on people's ambition, which it would be hard to lay at their individual door, lay the blame at their individual door. So this is very much a service-based cluster. So I think it's 75% of all clients for businesses in the CDIC cluster are other businesses, and they're generally bigger businesses. So most companies are serving bigger businesses, and it's very difficult to extract the real value of the work that you do when you're in a relationship with a much more powerful or bigger client organisation. My background before Wired Sussex was in TV, and I used to work for a number of, and run a couple of independent TV production companies. And 10, 12 years ago, people used to say the same thing about that group of companies that they say about some of the companies in Brighton. They used to say, you're just lifestyle companies, you haven't got any ambition, you don't really want to grow. The government, I think it was in 2002, in the Communications Act, introduced something called Terms of Trade. And what Terms of Trade meant was that independent production companies were allowed to keep some of the IP that they created and didn't have to give it all to the broadcasters. That radically changed the nature of the independent TV production sector, and some of those very same people who are derided as not having ambition are now running TV production companies worth tens and tens of millions of pounds. And in fact, we've got one in Brighton with Ricochet who did exactly that, leveraging the IP that they could hold in Super Nanny. So there's a strong argument that actually there are structural determinants on your ambition, and therefore, you know, it's very hard to realise that ambition. So it's more like ambition thwarted than ambition non-existent. And the research backs this up in some ways, because what it finds is that CDIP businesses in Brighton are brilliant at creating value. So fantastic at innovating. SuperFused business is even better, but you know, in terms of the number of innovative practices around products, around services, around markets, around methods, very, very strong. SuperFused businesses are actually very likely to say that they will even undermine their own business models in order to innovate. A very high level of innovation. So it's a strong creative sector, but actually it's far less successful of capturing that value, at owning the value in the things that they create. It's only 1% of businesses registered IP in the 12 months that we did the survey. 50% of businesses appear to be producing materials which can be copyrighted, but only 8% have actually got royalties as a source of revenue. So we've got this very, very creative, innovative group of companies who find it very, very difficult to capture the value that they're creating, and it's leaking elsewhere. Now, from some economists' point of view, they'd go, well, that doesn't really matter as long as they're going to other parts of the UK economy because they're being captured somewhere. But often, of course, they're not just staying within the UK economy, they're within the world economy. Now, that doesn't mean that everything has to be about capturing value. So we've just come to the end of what I think, I hope, was a very successful Brighton Digital Festival. 174 events over the whole of September. And Brighton Digital Festival is a good example, I think, of something about creating value. It's about giving people the space and the room to undertake innovative, creative things. But it's actually not really about capturing value as an organisation. It's about cascading that value out to others within the city and others within the community to capture. There's a lot of debate, and there was a lot of debate last night at the London launch about what the role of universities ought to be in terms of capturing and creating value. Universities typically over the past 5-10 years or whatever have said what we want to do is create spin-offs. We want to hang on to some of the IP in the things that us as universities create, and we create spin-off companies, and then we'll make lots of money. Often actually they don't make lots of money. There's a kind of, I don't know if it's a truism or not, but I've heard it a couple of times that MIT makes more money from its t-shirt sales than it does from its spin-off activities. So you could argue that actually the role of universities should be to create value for others and allow businesses to capture that value. I'm not sure the universities would agree with that. So, to sum up, Brighton CDIC cluster delivers significant value to the local economy, is growing rapidly, and is driven in its heart by these SuperFused businesses, which are very fast growing, more likely to be innovating, more likely to emphasize a company culture which is designed to attract and nurture and grow its talent, and that's part of the innovation process, and are more likely to network. I think the question is, okay, what does that mean in terms of what people do? So the fuse box is one way that Wired Sussex has tried to respond to the research. So usually with these things, you do the research, then you sit down and analyse it, and then you go, okay, is there a way that we can use this practically in the real world? And we say, well, we're learning this stuff as we're going. Why don't we set up something which takes some of the learnings from the research and test them out as we're going along? And, you know, that's really what the fuse box is all about. It's testing out some of these things. But apart from us, what else is to be done? And what we found is, in terms of challenges to the growth of the CDIT cluster, it kind of fell into two connected, I suppose, areas. One is that the infrastructure of Brighton is definitely not keeping pace with the growth of the sector, and that's a real challenge for businesses. So, I've taken two quotes here, one about broadband and one about office space. The one about office space is interesting actually because, you know, it's the comparison, isn't it? It's comparing us with Manhattan. When I first came to this job, actually, I met a councillor who is definitely not here tonight, and he said, you know, we're not doing badly because we're doing better than Taunton, you know. Actually, now businesses are comparing us with Manhattan, and that is the challenge, I think, and that is one of the challenges for the council, for the LEP, for the government, is that in order to continue to grow, the infrastructure needs to catch up with the growth of the businesses. But there's something else as well, and that's that what we're seeing really is a change in the way that businesses operate. And we did a series of kind of video interviews with a number of people to kind of frame this discussion, and when we get a chance we'll edit them as well. And at the end I asked them all, you know, if I was David Cameron and you had your 2 minutes with me, what would you tell me to do? What would you want me to do? And without fail, everyone talked about the deficiencies of the education system in terms of being able to deliver the kind of people that an economy, a post-industrial, if you like, economy like ours needs. And it wasn't all about, you know, conveyor belt programming and stuff like that. It was much more subtle and nuanced than that. And this quote from Jenny, I think, Jenny Lloyd of Nixon McInnes, I think kind of sums it up really. that we need to rethink the education system in a way that meets the needs as they are now, not how they were. And that's a greater challenge because it's a societal challenge. It's not a challenge that we can expect a local authority, however competent, to deal with. Okay, so that's it from me. That's, as I said, a broad overview of the whole thing. I've flattened out a lot of the bumps and the curves, and there's far more in that report than I could possibly talk to. But thank you very much, and let's move on.